All right. We've got people piling in here.
And I think I need to be made a host,
Uh,
right? So I can share my screen.
shh. Let me see if I can control that. I cannot. There we go.
I am the host now.
Okie dokie. So we've got 34 people so far. We're going to give it another minute before we get going. While we are waiting for people to trickle in at the end here, I'm Ryan Warnicki. I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager at Feathr. I'm the host for today. I have the pleasure of kind of giving the stage to Laura MacDonald of the Benefactor Group. I'll do an intro in a bit, but while folks are piling in, it'd be really nice to know, number one, where you're from, and number two, what your main responsibilities are at your organization. Is it more marketing? Is it more fundraising? Is it all of the things? So please go ahead and introduce yourself that way in the chat, folks.
While we're doing that, for whatever reason, Ryan, let me look at my settings, but I'm not seeing, oh, maybe this will fix it, where I can share screen or where I can see. And with apologies
Melinda.
to the
Oh,
group,
sorry. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
uh, I think I've got it now.
Okay. Um,
Great.
uh, so Melinda, we've got Changing My Stars in Madison. I also live in Madison, if that is Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm going to the AFP happy hour a little later this afternoon. You do it all. We've got an all things with Cassandra for FlowFest. Uh, Dawn Ellis, Share the Table, all of the things, a little bit of everything. Cassie in Atlanta. Hey, that's one of your hangouts, Laura. We focus on marketing, but we want to know more about fundraising. Wright State, Major Gifts College of Engineering and Computer Science. Well, that is narrow in scope. Western Illinois University, go next from Jenny, mostly fundraising, but a little bit of marketing and copywriting, Indie Dance Council, all of the above. Cody Oliver from Harrisonburg, Virginia. I believe that's JMU. ED, one staff, member of an education foundation, Crystal here, Marketing Hope from Miami. So it seems like the majority of people are all of the above. But otherwise it's kind of balanced between the two. So we've got 48 people. We're 4 minutes into the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Laura, are you able to share your screen or?
Yep,
Okay,
that was operator error. I've got it figured out.
sweet. Well, I'm guilty of that on a daily basis. So everybody, thanks again for joining. Ryan Warnicki with Feathr. I get to play host today, and I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful Laura MacDonald. I will say nice things about her that will make her uncomfortable. Laura is the founder and one of the principals at Benefactor Group, and she'll introduce herself a little bit more and explain what that means a little further. But she helps organizations across the country fundraise, and she's been doing that for quite some time. And one of the reasons we're really lucky to have her as the presenter today to go through this year's Giving USA results is she is a past chair of the Giving USA Foundation. And the Giving USA Foundation is the organization that essentially oversees the creation and distribution of the Giving USA report. And there's a ton of moving parts. Years ago, I got to work with her and do some of that, and I can share that she is an amazing volunteer leader. And I'm sure her clients are quite lucky to work with her. So with that, Laura, I'm gonna pass it on to you to introduce yourself. I'll ask you one or two questions, and then we'll kind of dive in.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And I'm delighted to be here with everybody today. I am going to go ahead and share screen. I continue to have Zoom doing weird things, but I think you all are seeing what you're supposed to see. I hope. Are you?
Yeah, I can see you and the screen equally.
Okay.
Um,
Is that what we want, or do we want something different?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if there's anything on the settings side on my end, but I don't know why it's showing up that way. Could someone in the audience let us know if you're seeing Laura and her screen like in the same size or if you're mostly seeing the screen share? Okay. Oh,
Are we
hmm.
good?
It looks like they're seeing what we're saying.
Let me go ahead maybe while you do a little bit of
Okay.
troubleshooting in the background, Isa, and I'll just go ahead. I think they'll be able to see the
Perfect.
deck well enough, and I'm also happy to share the deck afterwards if that's helpful to people if they'd like to receive it as well. So if you are seeing the deck and half of the screen, is it working or not?
It's still half and half. Laura, if you email it to me, I can try to share my screen and present it.
Okay, let me do that. Sorry, folks, and thank you for your patience. Does this make any difference?
Well,
Now, someone in the chat said you might have both of your screens shared. I'm wondering if that's the case.
Laura, how many Giving USA presentations have you done this year? Hey, there we go.
Here we
Is
go.
that better? Does that work
Yeah.
for everybody? Good. This is probably my sixth or seventh, and I've probably got that many more scheduled. So sorry for usually they're seamless, folks. Sorry for the technical issues. But what I'd like to do is go ahead and just share with you um, a little bit of background about me and the firm, and then we'll dive into Giving USA. So you can see some background here. I did start Benefactor Group 26, almost 27 years ago. We work with nonprofit organizations in a variety of disciplines. I'll talk about that next. As Ryan said, probably the highlight of my career to date was the privilege of serving as chair of the Giving USA Foundation in 2020, 21, 22. And basically, as he said, we're the publishers for Giving USA, which means a couple of things. We get to make sure that there's enough money to publish it every year and also contribute to the content of it. So it's a wonderful opportunity. Also, in 2024, I wrote the Endowment Handbook, which was published by Wiley. So if I dig into endowment, that might be why. Um, the firm that has grown now to have a national presence and works primarily in four areas. A lot of work in fundraising, from capital campaigns to annual fund capacity building, a lot of endowment building now. We also have a search division that helps organizations find the talent that they need. Our strategy team does primarily either strategic planning or governance assessments, and they are passionate about the role of a healthy board in really having a high functioning nonprofit organization. And then our NP tech team, as we call them, that does a lot of system selection, optimization, technology choices, all of that. So that's Benefactor Group and the background that I bring to the conversation we're having today. And each year since the firm joined the Giving Institute in about 16 years ago, and one of the driving factors in that decision was that gives you an opportunity to participate in the production of Giving USA. And so every year we have produced an infographic, sort of a whimsical storytelling way to present the video or the data that's in Giving USA. So you can, and I heartily recommend that you get the 400-page book and take it to the beach to read in August. Um, and then we try to do a summary snapshot of what's in the book in this infographic. You can use the QR code if you want to download it, or you can even fill out a form in old school. We will put some in the mail and send them to you if that's of interest. So many of the graphics you're going to see look a little idiosyncratic because they're coming right out of our infographic. So let's dive in. You know, we chose a theme this year of hustle and bustle and sort of a cityscape, in part because there's a lot of complexity this year in Giving USA, in the charitable giving environment, and a lot of opposing forces, some very positive for philanthropy, some creating some headwinds for philanthropy. But the top line is that charitable giving in 2025 was $617 billion with a B. And that was about a 6% increase over total giving the year prior. Now, I will say Giving USA, the team that we work with at Indiana University is made up of economists. And economists love to look at inflation adjusted data. Uh, I don't know about you, but I happen to live in a current dollar world. So all of the data that I am going to share with you is in current dollars. But if you look at the data from Giving USA, they also have the inflation adjusted numbers. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. So what do we know beyond that? We know that who gave all of that? This pie chart has changed subtly over the last decade or two. So what we see is that of that $617 billion, the lion's share continues to come from individual donors who are making gifts of their own money. And so, I think in many of your organizations, very well-intentioned board members will ask you about the foundation proposal that you're working on or the corporation that you're approaching for a sponsorship. The reality is that the majority of charitable giving comes from individual donors, and that 64% or 394 billion is individuals giving out of their own resources. So writing a check, using their credit card, what have you. It is true that foundations, the percentage that comes from foundations has grown and grown dramatically in the last several years, and now represents 20% of all charitable giving. There are two reasons for that growth. One is that most foundation assets are invested in the market, and we know that the market has performed very well for the last several years, and so those foundation assets have grown. But the other thing is that many individual donors are creating donor advised funds and giving out of the donor advised fund. And that's where this would be showing up as individual donors that have either created a closely held family foundation or a donor advised fund, and they're giving from that. So they're still acting a lot like individual donors. Corporations have now increased to 7% of all charitable giving. I will say a couple of things. Of that $43.6 billion that corporations gave, about half of that, over $20 billion of that, is the value of drugs that pharmaceutical companies give to individuals. So these are individuals who can't afford their medications, and the pharmaceutical companies are giving them drugs. So that means that the cash portion that is left is modest. The other thing, we'll talk some about the headwinds that are going to face corporate giving as we move forward. And then finally, big growth, particularly in percentage terms, in giving from bequests. So again, individual donors making decisions about what's going to happen to their money after their lifetime. So if we look at all of the individual giving, all of the bequest giving, and half of the foundation giving, individuals really give something like 83% of all charitable dollars, making decisions about what is or was their own money. So that's much of what we see there. The other thing that I'll say real quickly about, we look at this and we think, oh, wow, individual giving only grew 4% and bequest giving grew 20%. So what's going on there? A couple of things that we'll touch on. One is that, yes, bequest giving is growing, and we feel that we're beginning to see the beginning of the great intergenerational transfer of wealth. But the other thing is, if we don't just look at the denominator, because bequests grew 20%, but from a much smaller base. So bequests actually grew about $10 billion, whereas giving from individuals actually grew about $15 billion. So look not just at the percentages to determine the health of these sectors or sources, look also at the actual dollars. So let's keep going. And Ryan, if you see questions in the Q&A or even any further guidance on technology, just break in and let me know. But otherwise, I'll just keep rolling. So let's talk about who received all of that charitable giving. The largest recipient of charitable gifts continues to be religion. And by religion, we mean almost exclusively houses of worship of any faith. Protestant, Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, what have you. And what you might hear is that giving to religion has declined. Technically, it hasn't gone down. It just has not grown as fast as all of the other sectors, and so it has lost market share. And you might think to yourself, well, that's okay. I'm not a religious organization, and so if that means I'm getting a bigger slice of pie, that's great. And I would say to you, it's not great for two reasons. First of all, we shouldn't just be fighting over the size of our slice of pie. We should all be working to make the pie bigger. But secondly, we know that the percentage of American households who attend religious services regularly has declined by about 20, it's declined by about 20 million households since the beginning of this century. The percentage of the number of households that participate in charitable giving has declined by about 20 million households since the beginning of this century. We don't know that they're the same households, but we know that historically there's been a very strong correlation between households that make charitable gifts and households that participate in religion. So then the question for all of us becomes, if next generation donors are not learning or seeing charitable giving behavior sitting next to their parents in the pew, how can we create a social norm that charitable giving is something that they do? So giving to religion, we should all care about the fact that slice of the pie is shrinking. You'll see that human services is the second largest recipient. This has been a bit of a swap. Education used to be in the second spot consistently. Human services has taken that over for the last few years. I think that's probably a permanent swap. And it has to do with how uh, donors who are born after 1964 feel about their giving, and they want to give to a cause. And often alma mater has not been positioned as a cause. They're all about institutional loyalty. They're changing, but that's been their positioning, whereas human services are adept at positioning their mission, their work as a cause. And you can see all of the others. I will say a couple of things that we see strong growth, especially in some of the sectors that traditionally have attracted gifts from high net worth households. And we continue to see that, that the K-shaped economy out there in the world where the wealthiest households are doing great and their wealth is increasing and everyday households are struggling and they're finding their buying power is decreasing. The same thing is happening with charitable giving, that more and more of that is concentrated from those at the top of the economic ladder. And frankly, in the results that nonprofit organizations experience, that the largest nonprofit organizations, their contributed revenue is growing. Smaller organizations are having more of a challenge. But those are the source or the uses of charitable giving that we track in Giving USA. And by the way, those sectors, it wasn't an arbitrary decision. That's how the IRS categorizes nonprofit organizations. And therefore, to the extent that Giving USA is an econometric model, there isn't a gerbil at the IRS going through every single tax return and counting dollars, but we do use IRS data, and so that's one of the reasons why we categorize it the same way the IRS does. So in that description, you may have sense that there's a difference between how Giving USA is produced and how something like the Fundraising Effectiveness Project quarterly reports or the Blackbaud Index quarterly reports are produced. They're taking data directly from some of the CRMs that manage gifts, which is great, but it can also be idiosyncratic. For example, FEP, the FEP data is very valuable. If you don't subscribe to it and look at it every quarter, you should. But understand that they're dealing with a subset of nonprofit organizations that tend to use some of the smaller, less sophisticated databases.
I'd also add that smaller or larger organizations are intentionally kept out from that data set, which if we think about where some of the biggest gifts this year have gone to, they're not going to show up in FEP data. And so, with that in mind, Laura, could you add a little bit of context? You've been using this data before you were even involved with the Giving Institute and the Giving USA. Can you talk about contextually when you sit down with a client and you
Mhm.
think about, hey, why is this valuable? Why is this helpful? What are the things that we want to pay attention to? And what can we say? Hey, that's really interesting, but there might not be actionable information there.
I will say a couple of things. We find, particularly with some smaller organizations where perhaps the board members, this is the first board they've served on, or the second one, um, that they often have the same assumption that much of the rest of society does, which is that the big gifts are coming from corporations and foundations. And so even just showing them that initial pie chart that says no, the majority of philanthropic dollars come from individual donors who are making decisions about their own money, that really fundamentally changes how you structure a fundraising program and the role that you ask your board members to play in helping to amplify your story to individuals who are in their circle. So I think that's one of the key ones, is that top line. Secondly, we know, Giving USA is this amazing longitudinal data set. The good data goes back to 1967. So a few years ago, when inflation came back into the economy for the first time in 40 years, and people were saying, what impact does inflation have on charitable giving? I thought to myself, we have the data. Our data goes back more than 40 years. So let's look at what happened in the past. And so we can also see how, and in fact, on our website, and I think at the end of this, you'll see links to our website, benefactorgroup.com. If you Google "Giving is Resilient" at Benefactor Group, you'll see a tool that we created that lets you go through the data. We haven't yet updated it for this year's data that just came out, but say what happens to charitable giving during times of recession, during times of inflation, during times of presidential elections, during times of other social and economic upheaval. And it can really begin to give you a sense. But what's really important is that no organization is a hostage to this data. In every kind of economic climate, there are nonprofit organizations that thrive, even if we have huge headwinds. There are nonprofit organizations that struggle, even if the economy is thriving. And so none of this is to say that, just resign yourself to your fate because of the economics, but it can begin to tell you which part of my fundraising should I be dialing up and which part maybe should I be dialing down right at the moment. So I think, and as you just heard, and I'll touch on this later as well, we think one area of your fundraising program that you should be dialing up right now is planned giving, because the great intergenerational transfer of wealth, there's evidence now in the data that it's starting to take place. Since you asked, Ryan.
Real quick, one last thing. Just everybody, so you know, I have the ability to chime in and ask questions of Laura at any time because I have the power of a microphone. But Laura is open to pretty much any and all questions at any point. So if you have questions, please chime in, please share. I'll pop those over to her when she pauses for a breath,
Yeah.
so that we can make this a little more conversational and tailored to what you all want.
Exactly. I love for this to be conversational and to meet the needs of those of you who are in the audience. And I appreciate Jade injecting some optimism into our conversation already, talking about some of the generosity that they are seeing in their community and in their mission work. So that's good to hear. I will say that, as I mentioned, Giving USA is an econometric model. So the statisticians we work with at Indiana University have spent a long time honing a model that takes into consideration a variety of data points. And oh, by the way, if you really want to know what they are, in the book, the summary of methods runs 8 pages. So if you want to know how do you come up with all this, it's in here. And there's a advisory board made up of data scientists and statisticians and academicians, etc. They know that some of the most important factors include the market performance, and specifically they track the S&P 500. So that tends to have a significant impact on giving by foundations because their assets are growing, on giving by high net worth individuals because they just feel wealthier when they see that their retirement portfolio is growing, and to a lesser degree on corporations. The other thing that has a significant impact, especially on corporate giving, is GDP. As GDP goes up, corporate profits tend to go up, and so that has a significant impact on corporate giving. Disposable personal income, so that's what's left to spend after all of the necessities are paid for, housing and food, etc. It grew, but not as fast. So it grew at 4.4%. And that really has an impact on the everyday donor household and how they give. So those were all positive on the positive side of the scale. But the thing that's now creeping in is that we are seeing that consumer sentiment dropped as much as we've ever seen it drop in a year. So that's really that and inflation are what affect the ability of the everyday household to give. And so I think that that's further evidence of that K-shaped economy that I talked about and why more and more dollars are coming from a smaller and smaller proportion of American households, primarily those that are high net worth. And if anybody wants to know the definition of high net worth, just ask the question in chat and I'll be happy to give it to you. One thing that I do want to touch on as well, because we always get questions about it, is donor advised funds. And knowing that this audience is made up of a mix of folks from fundraising to marketing to administration, big nonprofits and small. I'll just talk briefly about donor advised funds. I think that we all understand that it's essentially a charitable checkbook that a donor, almost always an individual, had, and often as a result of some sort of a windfall, an inheritance, the sale of an asset, the sale of a business, retirement bonus, things like that. They know that they want to use some of that windfall for charitable giving, but they don't want to have to decide all at once. And so it's quite common that they will set up a donor advised fund. When they put the money into the donor advised fund, that's a charitable gift. They get the tax benefits at that time. And then they have the option of sending money out from that donor advised fund over the course of time to the organizations they care about. We did see a surge in the use of donor advised funds at the end of 2025, and we expected to see it, primarily because of the change in tax law. One thing that Giving USA tells us over the years is that every time there was a significant change in tax law, it did have an impact on charitable giving. Usually what happened is donors rushed to give before it took effect. So there was a big rush to giving at the end of 25 to give under the old rules, and then a bit of a hangover in the year in which it does take effect. So we saw that from 86 to 87. We saw that from 2017 to 2018. And we believe we're seeing it again as the new tax law took effect on January 1 of this year. So it has led to an increase in the number of accounts, the assets held in those accounts. And while I know that there are varying views on donor advised funds, and I should disclose that I have two. My husband and I have a donor advised fund that we use for our individual giving. Our firm has a donor advised fund that we use to make sure that we can always match our employees' gifts regardless of the firm's performance, that we can keep that promise. So clearly, I think that they have a tool, that they have a role to play. There is not a payout requirement in donor advised funds, and yet we know that, and if you look at the chapter in the book on donor advised funds, that typically they pay out somewhere between 15 and 20% of their total value annually. So a far higher percentage than the typical foundation pays out, for example. So while I think there are a lot of conversations to be had about how best to make donor advised funds most effective and efficient in the nonprofit sector, I think we need to be careful about what we regulate for fear of some unintended consequences there.
Thanks.
One of the things, go ahead,
Real quick.
Ryan.
So we've got a question from Sydney Dotson Galiban, who's down in Tallahassee, Florida. And it was actually about the previous slide. So if you want to pause on this and keep talking about DAFs, by all means. But she wanted you to expand a little bit on consumer sentiment. So can you share, like, hey, what is consumer sentiment? To the extent you know, how is that calculated? And
Yeah.
historically, maybe, how has that impacted giving?
So as I said, consumer sentiment, this is a piece of data. I'll even take a look at page 363 but this is a third-party source that Giving USA relies upon. I believe that data point comes from the federal government, and it's a periodic survey that they conduct. And it's just how optimistic are households about their future economic health. And it influences things like, do they buy large durable goods like washing machines and refrigerators and cars. It also affects particularly the giving decisions of everyday households. It's really a barometer of how affluent do I feel and how confident do I feel that I'm going to continue to have sufficient resources to maintain my style of living. And so that's what that measures. It does come in to get pulled into the, I'm not going to find it real quickly, but look at the methods here. And it impacts their thinking, particularly about spontaneous gifts. One of the things that we say is that whenever surveys are done, donors who participate in a faith community almost always say that religion is my top giving priority. Maybe education is 2 and children's health is 3, what have you. That doesn't necessarily mean that they make their largest gift to religion. But what it does mean is that if they come into a year when they're really facing some economic difficulties, the one gift they'll keep making is the gift to religion, regardless of its size. And so I think it also tends to, Ryan has given us the chapter and verse there of where the consumer sentiment comes from. So yeah, it's an objective third-party source that we rely on. And it affects more, like I said, more everyday donors versus the high net worth households. The other thing that we know has had a really significant impact on the health of nonprofit organizations today is the government, the cuts in government subsidies. Do you like our little ape there, yeah, King Kong? If you get the full infographic, you'll also see that there's a robot. Our artist always likes to drop a few Easter eggs in. But what we are seeing, particularly in some of the human service areas or health adjacent fields, is that the amount of government funding that is available is significantly declined, and or the hoops that an organization needs to jump through to secure this funding has increased. It's less reliable. In the past, for many nonprofit organizations, finding a stable public funding source was often viewed as one of the best pathways to get to resilience. In this current environment, we see that that's not the case. And we know that there is not enough philanthropy to make up for the cuts in federal funding. There simply isn't. And so we can't expect donors to fill those gaps. And it's creating some real headwinds for nonprofit organizations out there. I do think that it leads to some short-term giving, perhaps the HIV organization that was in the chat earlier, and others, where donors want to lean in and do what they can. We certainly saw that during COVID with the upswing in support for organizations dealing with food insecurity or housing insecurity. The math doesn't math. There isn't enough in charitable giving to make up for these losses and these cuts. So I think that it is going to result in some really dramatic reshaping of our landscape. Sorry, that's not very abundant, but it's kind of where we stand right now. We did look at, one of the things that we look at a lot, and that's us as a firm, not necessarily Giving USA. Some of this is coming from other sources. And for a long time, we've talked about monthly giving. And for some donors, monthly giving can be a super convenient way to give. And for organizations, it can be really stable, reliable, year after year, month after month. Great way to do donor retention. Never take them for granted. Make sure that you're always doing the stewardship that you need to be doing. But it can be a great formula. But we're seeing that, maybe we have reached the saturation for that cohort of the population that wants to give through monthly giving. And that actually we've seen that growth in one-time gifts is now outpacing growth in monthly gifts. I guess what I would say to any organization I'm talking to is do both. Meet donors where they are. Give them options in multiple ways to come into your organization. But that's an example, Ryan, of where the data can really begin to inform what should our strategy be. Should we do only one or only the other? I don't think so. And technology can help you easily accommodate both of these. I do want to touch just briefly on something that I talked about earlier, and that is that we see top-heavy distribution both in the sources of charitable giving, that something like 65% of the dollars come from 3% of the households, that it's really high net worth donors that are driving the top line growth of charitable giving. And we also see that more and more of that is going to the largest organizations. And so while you see growth Amongst those who are giving the most and receiving the most, what we see is that as organizations and frankly donor households get smaller and smaller in terms of their financial resources, that they're facing stronger and stronger headwinds. I don't have an easy answer for how you deal with that if you are a nonprofit organization. I think there are lots of things that you can be doing with, looks like somebody's otter is about to expire, so you might want to deal with that in the chat. But thinking through how do we structure a resilient contributed revenue program with multiple lines of revenue so that we don't have donor concentration risk or revenue concentration risk, but emulate some of the things that the big organizations do since they seem to have the wind at their back. Because the other thing that we see is that as philanthropy relies more and more on the ultra wealthy, it creates what we've decided to call donor concentration risk. If you've got one donor who's accountable for 20% of your contributed revenue, and that donor has a reversal of fortune or falls out of love with your mission, that's a huge risk. And so while it's important for every organization to have a thoughtful major gifts program, if you rely on it too heavily and you don't have other sources of revenue that balance that out, then you're exposing your organization to some pretty significant risks. So that's the other thing, Ryan, I would say that all of this data tells us is, as with anything, have a diversified revenue plan. Don't just rely on one type of revenue, contributed, earned, invested, public, and don't rely on just one kind of contributed revenue. So you've heard me talk a lot about major gifts from individual donors, and that has become the dominant type of philanthropy in America today. But if that's all you got, then you also have risk there. So a more diversified revenue approach. I talked a little bit earlier about whether or not the great intergenerational transfer of wealth has arrived. Sometimes when I speak to a crowd, I would love it if in the chat, if anybody would just put raise their hand or put an icon or do something. If your organization has been inundated with realized bequests, all of a sudden you're just getting all these bequests coming in. You don't even know where they're coming from. I rarely get a strong show of hands when I ask that question. But a couple of folks are saying that they have begun to see that. What we've learned from people like Russell James, who's a great scholar and researcher in this space, is that the great intergenerational transfer of wealth, there are 124 trillion with a T, trillion dollars held privately by those who were born before 1964 in America, so the baby boom and older. That is data. The money is there. I think that it's also a certainty that those people will die eventually, and the money has to go somewhere. The early assumptions, though, were based on typical lifespan tables, and the reality is that people who are wealthy live longer. People who are wealthy and generous live longest of all. So this is actually happening later than some of the early estimates predicted. It'll probably reach its height in about 2045, when half of the baby boom will have attained age 85. But we are starting to see bequests tend to be a fairly volatile sector in Giving USA. One ultra wealthy individual passes away and all of a sudden it creates an outlier event that can't be repeated the next year. But if you try to smooth that out by looking at 3 or 5 year windows, what we're seeing is definite growth in bequest giving, which says to me that there are some steps that, and this is part of the infographic if you request it as well, but some very specific steps that every organization should take to prepare themselves for this transfer of wealth. I will say that the estimate is that of that $124 trillion, baby boomers will spend some during their lifetime on healthcare, on lifestyle, etc., on taxes. So some will be spent. About $100 trillion will go to younger generations, and at least half of that will go to women. And oh, by the way, when a high net worth household, when the first spouse passes away, it goes to the surviving spouse, who is almost certainly a woman. So if you are still playing by a playbook that was written for old white male wealthy donors, it is going to become less and less effective for you. So I would say, Indiana University has a Women's Philanthropy Institute that's got some great data. Women give differently than men. I've begun to make the statement the future of philanthropy is female. And so study up on how women give, how they like to be talked to as donors, because they're going to inherit a significant portion of this, either as a surviving spouse or as the daughter of wealthy parents. And these are some of the things that you can do to get ready for all of that. Finally, you can understand this data point, which is a bit self-serving,
Laura,
but
I have a quick question on the last
yep,
slide where you
yeah.
say popularize bequests, right? Tell stories of donors who left part all their estate and show how their legacy of generosity fuels your mission today. So a lot of people, even when an organization knows bequest intentions, a lot of people might feel a little odd trying to get and share those stories because you have to reintroduce the concept of mortality to people,
Hmm.
right? So when
Right.
you work with organizations, how do you encourage them to get some of those early stories when there are known intentions?
I love that question because, as you know, Ryan, I love drilling into the fascinating work that's being done by behavioral economists and some of the other folks in the Science of Philanthropy Initiative. We know that one of the most powerful statements you can make in fundraising is people like you make gifts like this to a cause like ours. And so that's really what we're trying to affect here is social norming. I sometimes tell a story that I personally passed a milestone birthday about 18 months ago. And when I did, the mail in my mailbox began to change. And I started receiving these oversized postcards. And many of them had a picture of a woman, but she was an older woman gazing softly into the distance. Maybe she was knitting. She looked a little bit timid. And I thought to myself, that is not a woman like me. This postcard is not working for me. Clearly they were asking me to consider my own estate plan. So be careful here because you want the stories that you tell, or you want to allow donors to tell their own stories to really reflect the donors that you're trying to attract. Typically, the person who makes the first decision about including a charitable bequest in an estate plan happens earlier than you think. It happens in somebody's 50s. It's not when they're 80. They've done their estate planning by then. But the other thing we say is that you're right, Ryan, there is mortality aversion. And the best way I know to overcome mortality aversion is to swap it out for the perpetual hero story. To invite these donors to become perpetual heroes. Bob and Jane, you have supported our organizations so generously and consistently over your lifetime. And I know that you've made arrangements for that support to continue even after your lifetime. We'd love for you to share your inspiration in doing that with others so that they have the opportunity to be a perpetual hero as well. So that's the main thing that I would say is use the perpetual hero story to try to overcome that mortality aversion. And then cite examples and make sure you have diverse donors, racially diverse, um, age, generation, gender, diversity, telling stories about either why they decided to include your organization in their estate planning or make you the beneficiary of their retirement assets, whatever they've chosen to do. And then also some of the realized bequests that you start to receive. And there, I think it's really important not to focus on the magnitude of the bequest. Hooray, we got a $600,000 bequest. Focus on the impact. You know, Sally Jones left a generous bequest, and because the board has wisely chosen to place that in our endowment, we will now have $30,000 a year in perpetuity to fund a scholarship. So talk about what the impact is, not about the money itself. The decision to make a bequest is really comes out of the part of the brain that is autobiographical. And so it's how, people are telling their own story in this part of the brain, and the bequest intention becomes part of their autobiography. And so that's why it's not about dollars. And yes, at some point, some of them might talk to their advisors about different vehicles, whether it's a trust or an outright bequest or what have you. But what you, as a representative of a cause-based organization, want to focus on is not any of that, especially initially. You want to talk about their story and how they see themselves and what role they want to have in the ongoing story of your organization. Let me touch just briefly on a data point that came out that we loved because it is a bit self-serving, and that is to say that, and this was done by a study of 990s, an analysis of 990s submitted by the IRS returns submitted by nonprofit organizations, and they said that for every dollar invested in fundraising, it typically generates a $6 return the next year. So they looked longitudinally at it. For every dollar invested in a consulting partner, and all of this has to be revealed on the 990, right? That it has a $27 return on investment the next year. Now, I would attribute much of that to the fact that many consulting firms like ours work with organizations doing capital campaigns, which really catapults contributed revenue. But we thought that that was a really terrific data point, and one that perhaps members of our audience can use when they're talking about doing budgeting, whether to their board or their CFO or CEO, saying, hey, it doesn't happen immediately. It might not happen until next fiscal year, but when we make an investment in fundraising and we make a smart investment, the data says, this is also a study from Dr. Russell James. And in fact, at the end of this deck, and Ryan, you're welcome to share this deck with the audience if they want it, but also in the infographic, we cite all of the sources. That was drilled into my head when I worked with the Giving USA folks that, always cite your sources. And so you can see that this isn't just Benefactor Group making stuff up, that all of this is rooted in what we consider to be a reliable source. So we've been doing some Q&A as we've gone through. I'm happy to take some more if you have some, Ryan, or if you see any more showing up in the chat. And as we do that, I think what I will do is just say that our website is there, but also here, I'll give you the QR code again, or you can see the URL if you'd like to request a copy of the infographic. We'd be happy to send it to you. We geek out, Ryan knows this, we geek out on Giving USA. Me and a whole team of people here at Benefactor Group who helped produce this, and an artist that we've worked with for several years. And we're happy to share it with you, or if you have questions or would like to learn more about the firm, that's where you can do it.
Thanks, Laura. I would encourage you to go take a look at that infographic. Those are nice to socialize internally within your organization and your board. And Marty, thanks for sharing the link for everybody. For those of you who don't want to pull it up on your phone and you want it on your desktop, that is an easier solution.
Yeah.
It looks like we don't have any questions so far. We'll give it another minute. I have a question for you, a personal question, a kind of self-serving question, right? So, for those of you who attended today who are unfamiliar with Feathr, we're a digital marketing platform, right? There's certainly a ton of applications for planned giving. But one of the things that organizations typically use us for is to try and drive more, shall we call them smaller gifts, right? It could be a first-time donor, it could be a donor who has lapsed, it could be a donor as part of a Giving Day campaign. So, and we'll get to Cassie's question right after this. But if when you have worked with organizations who are trying to address the decreasing donor pool, right? There's fewer donors in the US, but organizations are always trying to grow and get new donors and retain donors and engage those donors. What are some of the things that you've seen with some of your customers that have been effective to cut through the noise and keep and grow an engaged constituency?
Great question. And then we'll get to Cassie's as well. So yeah, donor acquisition is probably one of the most expensive things you'll do in your fundraising program. So you're going to spend more to acquire a new donor than to hold on to an existing donor. So as with any business model, the first thing I would do is I would say is do great stewardship. Hold on to the donors you've got. Make sure you're thanking them. Make sure you're sharing with them the impact of charitable gifts and how they're driving your mission. Make sure that they hear from you regularly and not just when you're asking them for money. So I think retention, the first answer to acquisition is retention. Retain the donors you have. The next best pool of future donors is former donors. So, are you doing things to reach out to those who gave to your organization in the past using some of these platforms that they still may be receiving your messaging? They haven't chosen to give in a while, so but use that to recapture those lapsed donors. And then for purely brand new donors, donors who've never given to your organization, I think there are a number of things that can be effective. Let's go back to people like you, make gifts like this to an organization like ours. Can you use those tools to equip your donors to tell their own stories? Hey, let me tell you why I chose to become a $60 a month donor to Acme Arts Academy, and I hope you'll join me in doing this. So I think using social norming to push some of that. I would say that another important tool in our toolkit is insider status. How can you confer insider status on somebody who might want to become a donor? Is it using those platforms to invite them to some sort of a special preview of a new program or mission? So, can you make them feel like one of my colleagues, Paul Yagayan, has been doing some really interesting work, and he says that belonging comes before donating. How can you create a sense of I belong to something? I think you can use a lot of language that says, you're a member of our family because, and some of the things that you might do, like amplify our messaging. The baby boomers, you've probably figured out I'm a baby boomer. We used to call that slacktivism. We need to get over that because that act of elevating your social media platforms, that is a early signal that they're starting to feel like they belong to your family. So try to create that sense of belonging. And then when the time does come to invite them to make a gift, I think to do that, first of all, there's some things that you can do that might influence that. Um, Having them, first of all, pick something really specific that they could support, not just the general operating budget, but um, today we're raising funds to build for a new well. You might have had this well in your budget. Hopefully, you had that well in your budget. But the fact that the donor gets something concrete that they can associate their gift with is important for a point of entry kind of gift. That can create a point of entry, something specific that you're supporting with this particular request. Matching or challenge gift. We've got a donor who's given $1,000 and they'd like to see 10 new donors join them in making gifts of $100 each, some of those kinds of things. So I would say that all of those can be helpful. And then, the most fragile point in the relationship is between the first gift and the second gift. So have a defined donor journey, especially after that first gift. Use all of those tools Ryan talked about to implement that donor journey so that they feel great about that first gift. And when the time comes to ask them for a second gift, you're able to retain them. Because once you get that second gift, it makes it much more likely that they're going to stick with you for the long haul. And oh, by the way, a donor who has given to you for 5 out of the last 7 years, or maybe started giving to you 10 years ago and is still giving, that's your best planned gift prospect. Planned giving doesn't have anything to do with obvious indicators of wealth. The likelihood somebody will include you in their estate plan is really more linked to the loyalty of their giving, not the magnitude of their giving. So some of the organizations you just referenced, Ryan, they may have great planned giving prospects in their pool. And oh, by the way, it's not an either or proposition. If somebody includes you in their will, they are more likely to make an annual gift and give more. So if you want to strengthen your annual giving, do a planned giving program.
Thanks, Laura. That's great. So Cassie's question. Love your recommendations and outreach, build relationships with new higher income donors. The org we work with serves a community that has not been super willing to donate. Much of our funding comes from grants and governments. Basically, what group of people should they try to reach out to who have given in the past and, cold outreach? Like you talked about this a bit, so
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of tactics you could employ. And we could sit here and brainstorm all of them. Is it some sort of a lunch and learn? Is it your CEO is going to do a special briefing and here's the Zoom invitation? I mean, there are lots of ways, but really what you should say is how can we rekindle that sense of belonging that they had? So I'm not going to say that there's one tactic that's right for everybody who's with us today, but that's really what you're thinking about is how can we either kindle or rekindle that sense of belonging? It's easier to rekindle than start from scratch. Um, I would say, and this is can sometimes be an obstacle for folks, but start with your board. It is unrealistic to expect members of the community to support your organization financially if your board has not. And that can be a journey for some boards that don't really have a homegrown culture of philanthropy. But I would say start with current and past board members, or if you've got advisory boards or medical boards, or depending on the kind of organization you are, I would do all of those. And then I would go out to lapsed supporters. I would talk to some of your, particularly foundation grant partners and say, would you be willing to structure a portion of your support for us this year as a match or a challenge so that we can use that to leverage? Because they will appreciate the fact that you're trying to diversify your revenue. And to answer to Rodrigo, what we see, there's the good old fashioned 80-20 rule, right? So a lot of times if we look at a client's record of all of the donations that they've received, we'll say, okay, if they raised $1 million, tell me how many donors, if we start with the largest gift that you received and just start counting down to the next largest, how many gifts represent $200,000 of that revenue? So just keep doing the Pareto principle. Okay, that's my major gift pool. If that is fewer than 20, you got some risk concerns there. But do that. Okay, now take the $800,000 that's left, do the exact same thing again. How many of those donors, so 20% of 800,000 is 160,000. How many of those donors represent $160,000 worth of revenue? That's your mighty middle. How are you going to deal with them? Everybody else is an everyday donor, and that's going to be more of the direct response. And I would say do that analysis, do the 80-20 analysis, do it twice, your major givers, your middle givers, everybody else is an everyday donor. And that will begin to give you some sense of the health of your file. And hopefully it's not all concentrated in one or the other because that can be inject risk into your model.
Well, thanks for that, Laura. One of the things that I love about you, one of the many, is that you understand the really big picture and highly technical, academic, what could be considered esoteric elements of generosity, which sometimes play out in this report, but you can break it down into really meaningful and valuable takeaways where people can actually put some of this stuff in action. And that was a phenomenal example of that. Um, I'm going to take this opportunity to segue. We're going to do a really quick survey or a poll, if you will. So we're going to ask you, hey, would you like to get a demo of Feathr, learn more about Feathr, and to answer one of your questions earlier, Cassie, there's a ton of organizations who have used digital advertising as a channel to tell that donor story. And then in addition, hey, am I interested in learning more about Benefactor Group or, both, neither? So please go ahead and respond there. While everyone's responding, Laura, are there any closing remarks that you'd like to make? We're right about at the hour.
Well, I'm just bummed that my screen says hosts and panelists can't vote because I'd love to learn more about Feathr and your good work, Ryan. I know that you've contributed to the development and amplification of a lot of digital tools in the fundraising space. And so I'm really interested to learn more about the work that you're doing now. So count me in that category, even though I'm not allowed to vote. I think
Thanks.
just to encourage all of you, Giving USA is now a subscription. So you can subscribe to Giving USA, which means you get everything in the back catalog, plus you get the new report when it comes out. And I don't have one right here handy. We do special reports on topics like giving by generation. And when I say we, this is my volunteer gig. This is me as a volunteer past board member of Giving USA. So really go to the website, think about subscribing. If you're a very small nonprofit and it's a tough expense for you to handle, Your library probably subscribes. Your community foundation most certainly subscribes. Maybe your AFP chapter could throw in together and subscribe, because I think that, as I say, it's great beach reading if you haven't been on your summer vacation yet, and it's a lot of insights that can help you grow as a professional and strengthen your organization.
Thanks for that, Laura. I'll just quickly add, I dropped the link in the chat. So if you'd like to know where you can subscribe, that is where you go. Additionally, the Giving USA Foundation is a nonprofit and they accept charitable gifts. So if you would like to make a financial contribution to help the publication and dissemination of future reports, by all means, consider yourself invited to participate that way as well. With that, Laura, if you email this deck to me, we will get it out to everyone who attended and probably everyone who said they were going to attend but couldn't,
Okay,
along
great.
with the recording. So thanks so much, Laura. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Bye, everyone.